Welcome to Shaping the New York City Skyline, the podcast that explores the stories behind the buildings that shape our city. I'm your host, Brenda Slokowski, and I'm here with my co-host,
David Shamshovich.
Hey guys!
Hey everybody.
We're so excited to be here. As you can tell, we just had an amazing guest that we recorded, Jane Rosenberg of Seiden Schein. And she did deliver.
She has done everything.
Yeah. Like, I thought I knew Jane because we worked together constantly.
Yeah.
But I learned so much more about her. I really enjoyed having her on the podcast.
I specifically avoided talking to her for years just so that I could learn about her on this podcast. No, I knew little bits and pieces, but never to the degree that we spoke to her about and how her career was started as she wanted to be a journalist, and her dad inspired her to,
Do good.
kind of like Tucker Reed, right? Mm-hmm. Do good. I like that. Be a mensch. We've talked to lots of great developers, people that are just brilliant. And Jane is another brilliant mind. So she did lobbying work, AG work.
She was one of the people enacting condo and co-op legislation. Now she practices in that area and is now subject to the laws that she helped implement.
She talks about some of the projects that she worked on in Greenpoint, Manhattan, and there are a few others, many of which she worked on at Seiden Schein, of course.
She talks about so much. I can't wait for all of our Skyliners to listen.
There's a bunch of information here. There's a good understanding of how legislation gets passed, how lobbying works a little bit. You got a little bit of the AG stuff. What I like about this historical perspective is this institutional knowledge, and they see how those things change and evolved over time. And we think you'll love it. And if you do, drop us some comments. We'd love to hear from people. And anybody that's listening to us, whether they're a law student, whether they're somebody who wants to join the development community or be a developer, and feel free to reach out. You can pick up the phone and call us. Our phone number is available just to chat, ask questions.
We're here.
Yep, we're here. We love our Skyliners, and our Skyliners will definitely love Jane Rosenberg of Seiden Schein. So let's kick it into gear with JR. We have a wonderful guest, one that we've been waiting some time to speak with, but her schedule is very busy, of course, and she's got lots going on. She's a partner at Seiden Schein. Although she does work in a different group, she works in the Coop and Condo group, and she'll discuss that a little bit more and her background. Jane Rosenberg.
Hello.
Welcome.
I didn't know I would have such an applause.
Of course.
Yeah, I said this on the other podcast, but now that we have more listeners, we took a clap from every single person that listens to the podcast and put it all together. So there's about 50 trillion on there.
50 trillion. We're really growing.
We are growing by the trillion.
Yeah. Well, you could audit those numbers, by the way. They're real.
Yeah.
100%.
We're so excited for you to be here. We're trying to collect all of the great minds that Seiden Schein on this podcast, and you're definitely one of them. I want to understand a little bit more about where you grew up, how your upbringing was. What did your parents do?
I grew up on Long Island in Great Neck, which was a very liberal town at the time. And my father was a doctor. My mom was actually a professional artist. What's interesting about my parents is that my father had always said the most important thing is do good things for people. And we're talking many, many years ago. During World War II, my dad had done his medical school training in Scotland and then was drafted into the army right away and became an army doctor in Germany mostly and in France, and never wanted to talk about some of the things that he had seen. But when we were growing up, he said, whatever you do, do good things for people. And he went to Israel as a volunteer doctor during the 1967 war and again during the 1972 war. And there were friends who said, how could you leave home with small children and basically a non-working wife? And he said, it's important. And so that was kind of the background that I grew up with. I went to Mount Holyoke College, which at the time and still is a women's college in Western Massachusetts. I became the editor of my college newspaper, even though I wasn't an English major. I was a political science major. And this was during a time of a lot of political unrest around the country, various, demonstrations at different places in Colombia and other places, and sort of a youth movement which I don't think has really been replicated since then, of mostly students, and we're talking really basically middle class and upper middle class white kids, but that's the way it was, getting involved in the political process like they had not previously. So this was the era of Watergate and Woodward and Bernstein, and everybody wanted to be, sort of a muckraking journalist, put it that way. So I went, after college, I went to the Newhouse School at Syracuse University for my master's in TV radio production. And that was a fantastic experience for me. I did not want to necessarily be the anchor, but I did local reporting. My class actually produced the entire morning news show on this channel. And so we had to, and then while I was at that program, there was a law school at Syracuse University, and a new dean had been just appointed who wrote the textbook on mass communications law. So I was getting a little bit discouraged about my future job possibilities, because after you finish a program, and whether it's Syracuse or NYU or somewhere like that, the job path is sort of sweeping the floor in Plattsburgh for 2 years until you get the opportunity to move to Burlington, and then you go to Dayton, and then you go to South Dakota, and then and move up market by market. And that's kind of career path for people who are in broadcast journalism. So I went to see the dean because there was a lot of publicity about the new dean who had been appointed to upgrade the law school. And I went to see him and said, I'm really interested. I'm doing this degree. I'm interested in communications. And he said, why don't you come to the law school? You don't even have to go through an admission process.
How did that come about?
Okay. I knew that he had written the textbook on mass communication law. And I went to see him and said, you're the expert on communications law. I'm doing this communications program at Syracuse, and maybe I want to be a communications lawyer. So he said, why don't you enroll in the law school? You can stay in the master's program. So I ended up doing a couple of extra semesters, mostly working in TV stations in those summers between my years in law school, and not legal jobs of any kind. And so what was great is that when I was about to graduate law school in January of my last year, I was recommended by the dean to work at the Federal Communications Commission in Washington. And they were hiring something like 10 attorneys to start in a new class of attorneys at that agency. And everyone else, pretty much except me, I found out, had gone to Ivy League or similar type of law schools, except me. But the dean had recommended me, and I got this position in January. And I graduated in June and was going to take the bar exam in New York in July. So what happened is about a month before I took the bar exam, I got a letter, because no one had email then.
Or telephones, apparently.
Well, I guess so. I got a phone call too. I just remember the letter. And the letter said, because of federal budget cuts, we have to eliminate all of the positions of the people who were supposed to start this sort of, I can't call it, it's like a training program. Yeah. And so then I took the bar exam on my birthday in July. And so there I was, having graduated law school and taken the bar exam with no job. And virtually everyone I know already had some kind of job. So I had to go home and live with my parents. And I worked for many months as a copy editor for Brace, which is a big book publishing company at the time, because that was my background. And they offered me a position if I wanted to get my start in book publishing, but not on the legal side. But I was still interested in being a lawyer. So a good friend of mine from law school was working at Legal Aid in Philadelphia. At that point, I was looking for anything. And he said, we have there are positions here. Federal legal services, which is civil cases, and you could be waived in with a bar admission from another state. I had not yet even been admitted, but I went to Philadelphia and I interviewed, and they said, well, we're really looking for attorneys who can speak either Spanish or Italian. And at that time, Philadelphia still had a very large Italian population in the area that they call the Italian market. And I didn't speak either. So they said, we have other applicants who are bilingual. So why don't you go across the river to Camden, New Jersey, where they have a 6-county legal services program. So I went across the river and interviewed at Camden Regional Legal Services. And even though I didn't know Spanish, they hired me. And so I moved to Philadelphia, and I worked for 2 years as a legal services attorney. An excruciating, difficult experience for me.
Well, what kind of things?
What particularly was so difficult? Yeah.
Okay. Well, I know it's probably hard for you to realize this now, but The legal services program encompassed 6 counties in southern New Jersey. So it went from Burlington all the way down to Cape May. And we had the clients ranged from urban problems in Camden, which is a very depressed city that used to have industry. Campbell Soup and RCA were both headquarters there, which then had already moved out. And then we had migrant farm workers who were picking tomatoes for Del Monte in the southern part of New Jersey, who had housing problems and things. I had no legal background in New Jersey law. I was 25 years old, and they assigned me to Gloucester County, which is about, I can't describe it, it's across the river from Philadelphia and down some miles. I was the only female attorney in the county. I was not a local girl. You know, the attorneys, as in many semi-rural places, know each other. I didn't know anybody. I wasn't admitted in New Jersey. I was representing the poor people against the government agencies, such as the building inspectors and that kind of thing.
What was the jurisdiction that you had in terms of the subject matter?
Well, in the legal services programs, there is, depending on how many attorneys there are, the kinds of cases range from custody. There would be like the husband would grab the kids and run across state lines to Philadelphia. I had to go to federal court to try to get the kids back for the mother. A lot of housing issues where I had to get building inspectors to come to see these people like run down shacks where they lived. There were a lot of welfare application cases. People had applied for welfare. They couldn't get it. They didn't have health, those kinds of things.
It's interesting that they would have you do this varied number of things when usually if you're doing, certain services, they would fall within the same theme or subject matter, but it sounds like you were doing everything and anything that they threw at you, essentially.
Yeah. Well, that's true. And the reason was they were underfunded and understaffed. So I would go to court, and Superior Court in New Jersey is sort of the equivalent of Supreme Court in New York. And I would be the only female attorney in the room. All the way that it worked, and I don't know how it worked in New York courts, all the attorneys with cases would sit in the jury box and the judge would be up there, all male judges. So there would be me not knowing anybody. Anytime I slipped up, all the guys in the jury box would chuckle. I had one incident with a judge, which I can tell you about. I was representing, I can't even remember what the case was. And I stood up, and at that time in the courtroom, you'd have to wear, a skirt and jacket, suit, stockings, and, very proper. And I always had like pearls and stuff like that. And so I'm in the middle of my argument where I was deposing, I guess you would say, the local building inspector.
About like questioning, right?
About the, questioning, not deposing, questioning, right? The building inspector about his visit to this apartment complex where several of the clients, my clients, lived, where there were like rats and all kinds of horrible things. So in the middle of it, the judge says, "Counselor, approach the bench," in the middle of my questioning. So I go up there, and this is within hearing distance of all the guys in the jury box. And he says, "Counselor, what are you wearing on your feet?" And I was wearing what women would call back pumps, which are regular shoes, nice shoes with heels, but the back is not covered, but it has a strap around the back. Okay.
I'm imagining in my head right now.
Just to give you an idea of what we're talking about.
You have a wife, you don't know what a slingback shoe is?
No.
Okay.
We'll post pictures in the notes.
Right. But you're not, but it's not like I was wearing slippers or something or open.
The front of the shoe is a nice shoe. It's just that the back happens to be a little bit open.
So it's like the mullet of shoes. It's like a business in the front and party in the back.
Sure.
Probably. But it was, no, those were like a popular style back then. So he said, I said, I guess I would call them pumps. I mean, that's the word that
that's
you would
what
use.
they are.
He said, I call those sandals, and I don't want you wearing sandals in my courtroom again. So all the guys in the jury box chuckle, ha, 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 which of course totally threw off my train of thought. And so after 2 years of legal services. I felt like if I never entered a courtroom again, that would be too soon. And I don't think I ever have.
That's unfortunate that happened. So what was the last straw that made you say, I'm out of here?
I'll tell you what happened. So at the time, I decided I was going to take the Pennsylvania bar exam because I actually liked living in Philadelphia. And I was studying for the bar, and they had a job posting for a job in New York to be a lobbyist and to do general corporate type work for a not-for-profit organization, a 1-year assignment. So I went to New York and I interviewed for the job, and they said, they liked me and they hired me. And I said to the legal services program, I'm out of here. This is 2 years of that. And I moved to New York, and I thought it was only going to be for a year. And in fact, I sublet my apartment in Philly, and I sublet an apartment in New York. And then I ended up staying for 45 years or however long it's been, even though I did pass the Pennsylvania bar, right? The whole trajectory of my work completely changed. And the organization was called the New York Public Interest Research Group, otherwise known as NYPIRG. And there are similar organizations throughout the country. They were student-based. So in other words, they had chapters on different college campuses around New York State and a professional staff in Lower Manhattan. So at that time, my job was the student chapters of the organization did research in their communities on different issues like recycling, environmental issues, waste dumping into local rivers, things like that. And mortgage redlining, where banks were not issuing mortgages to people who lived in certain zip codes. And they would issue these reports. So my job was to edit the reports to make sure nothing slanderous was libelous was in there. And also, at the time, what they taught me to do is how to draft legislation, the whole lobbying process in Albany. And so I was there for 5 years. I learned how to draft legislation, lobby bills, write reports for legislators. I testified in front of the Nassau County Executive's Office. I traveled around the state and learned the whole legislative process of how it worked in New York. And I loved it.
I mean, it sounds very interesting. Sounds like it was better than appearing before that judge or probably any other judge.
And it introduced me to the power of community organization, and which at that time was very like a well-developed process that was happening throughout the state and throughout the country, where people felt very hopeful that if they got together with their neighbors and other people in their community, they could get things done.
Well, we're hoping the same thing today, right?
Right, but it doesn't happen today like it did then.
What do you think has changed from back then to today?
I think partly social media has so micromanaged people's activities that there wasn't that instant communication of people saying that anything that just came into their head.
That instant communication, email, text messages, that particularly social media where you have a mass amount of people who can respond in nearly real time.
Gives people the license to say whatever you want. One of the major focuses that we had as an organization was to try to so-called clean up the state legislature, which people have been talking about since then for the last 40 years. For example, when I first came to work at NYPIRG, there was no Freedom of Information law in New York. That was one of the bills that I lobbied and got passed. Now you take it for granted on the state and federal level. You can request documents behind a decision that supported a particular decision. Who wrote something in favor? Who wrote something against? Was this the product of some kind of undue influence or not? And they didn't have that on the state level. Most importantly, I think, they didn't have any conflict of interest legislation for state legislators. So New York has a part-time legislature like many states. So you could be a state senator and be on the board of a local bank and also be on the banking committee that regulated banks. And that was an issue that was one of my assigned issues to work on enacting conflict of interest legislation in New York. Federal government had it for a few years before, but we never had that in New York. So things that people now take for granted, open meetings. There was no requirement for state legislative committees to have open meetings. So people couldn't come and hear what was being said about a particular issue or why. And again, something people take for granted. That was one of the things that I was involved with lobbying.
So you were following your father's advice about doing good things. Part of this organization, you were really putting things in place, like I said, that we take for granted now, but that are very important for our process and making sure that our process is as fair as possible.
I remember a few weeks before my dad passed away, he said to me, I'm really glad that you're doing good things. And that really stuck with me because we were very close when I was growing up. That really meant a lot to me. So,
yeah, particularly since it sounded like it was very, very important to him. In fact, he put his life on the line for that very reason a number of times. So
yes,
getting that pat on the back, that justification, that's absolutely lovely. Must have made your career really.
Right. And actually, my 3 siblings each have different careers or had different careers, and they've all had some element of that in it.
But how did you move into the real estate space with the Attorney General?
When I was going back and forth to Albany, I made a lot of friends and colleagues. And after Bob Abrams was elected as Attorney General, his press secretary approached me one day and offered me a position in the AG's office and said, you're so good at doing the lobbying and all that. They wanted me to head up the legislative bureau. We spent a lot of time in the bar car and Amtrak. The 7:30 a.m. from Grand Central to Albany was the one that pretty much the New York City people took. So there were lobbyists, there were legislators, there were all kinds of newspaper reporters and people like that. So those of us that were on the good government, so-called, there was Common Cause, League of Women Voters, Catholic Charities, a lot of these organizations had people, lobbyists. And then I knew reporters in the press room. And there were always these parties all the time, cocktail parties in Albany where everybody was like getting together and maneuvering and schmoozing. So when I was offered to be the chair of the legislative bureau or be the bureau chief, I didn't perceive myself as like being a lobbyist or forever or staying in that kind of organization forever. I wanted to learn some kind of substantive area of law, but they didn't have any openings there. For some time when we were in Albany, I think he said, you interested in leaving NYPIR and would you like to be the head of our legislative bureau, which would mean half the week in New York and half the week in Albany. Yeah. And I said, flattered, but I need to learn some kind of area of law. So I don't want to head up the bureau. I'd be happy to continue doing lobbying on specific bills or legislative advocacy, whether it required going to Albany or not. But I need to learn some kind of legal, substantive area of law for the future.
You don't want to be in the same position you were in as a communications graduate where you didn't, your career was sort of in flux. You wanted to make sure that you had something substantive to do afterwards.
And right, that's exactly right. So, he said, well, what are you interested in? And I saw the AG at the office at the time had what they have most of, they have civil rights, consumer protection. They had real estate finance, which regulates co-ops and condos. They had charities, environmental. And so I said, well, actually what interests me is the Charities Bureau. And they said, well, we don't have any openings there. But in real estate finance, which regulates co-ops and condos, the entire industry is in a state of flux right now because the law at the time allowed in New York City, allowed buildings to be converted, occupied buildings to co-op and condo with only, I think, 35% of apartments being purchased and everyone else was subject to eviction after, I think, 90 days. It was like a phenomenon in New York City where people who had lived for years in rent-stabilized apartments in the Upper West Side, the Upper East Side, the Village, parts of Brooklyn, parts of Queens, the owner would propose to convert the building to co-op at the time. And if you chose not to purchase, you would have to leave in, let's say, 90 days. And so when Bob Abrams became Attorney General, one of the planks, if you call it, of his platform was to reform that law because it was such a cause of consternation throughout the entire city and a hot topic of conversation. You'd go on the subway and the people would talk about, did your building get a red herring? And a red herring is the initial offering plan for a conversion. And if you actually were in a position to be able to buy your apartment, the price to tenants was probably about 1/3 of market, half of market. And people flipped and made money. And in some cases was like their only nest egg, which actually ended up happening to me later. So I was lucky, although I was only selling my little studio. And if I had a 2 or 3 bedroom apartment, I had inherited from some wealthy uncle or something, I would have really,
Conversion, were you? Of your own? Were you at all?
Yes, actually. Not instrumental. what happened is while I was at the AG's office, my building actually got a red herring for conversion. And we had to go through a whole situation where I was not involved at all. And, so I was involved on the Tenants Association committee. The building only had like about 50 something units. We ended up suing the Attorney General's office in an Article 78 proceeding, right, which I did not do, and we were successful.
Speaking of conflicts of interest, Jane.
Right, I know. But I wasn't, it was actually an interesting situation that had not been the subject of any AG regulation before. Our landlord was trying to put our building, which was a renovated, previous walk-up, but renovated elevator building with a 4-story unrenovated or 5-story walk-up next door, was proposed to merge the tax lots so that our building would have to be responsible for renovating that building and bringing it up to code and getting rid of asbestos and things like that. So we actually had an attorney, it wasn't me, that basically advocated with the AG's office, not me, but advocated with the AG's office to require the sponsor to separate the two buildings and not all of the responsibility for renovating and upgrading the smaller building onto our building.
Right.
And that
I love that you were the subject of, your own career, your own, you're a real estate attorney. You experienced it as a tenant. Yeah.
Yes, I did. Right. So anyway, and that's why I ended up staying in that apartment for longer than I would have otherwise.
Yeah,
waiting for my payout. Because real estate finance, the co-op conversion was so hot and was so instrumental to Bob Abrams' victory as Attorney General, at least in terms of New York City, because it's Attorney General is a state position, I was asked to have a hybrid position. So I was in the Real Estate Finance Bureau. And so that's how I learned about co-ops and condos. But I was also lobbying for legislation in Albany to change the statute which governed the conversion of residential buildings.
This story's even getting better now, right?
Yeah, right.
Because now you're able to try to change the trajectory of the law that you're then
you're the subject of,
and that you're advocating for or against, I guess, depending on the situation. But to me, that's like seeing both sides of that coin and being able to just like do both. That's very interesting.
It was very interesting, and I showed you my pen, which you can't show on the podcast. And so what happened was I would spend half the week. So I left. NYPIRG, went to the AG's office, and I spent half the week in the Real Estate Finance Bureau reviewing offering plans and learning about, I knew nothing about real estate, learning about, at least about public offerings, co-ops and condos. And the Bureau had been totally decimated because since the market was so hot at that time and there was state had no conflict of interest legislation, people would come and work in the Bureau for 8 or 9 months and then go out into private practice immediately and submit the offer to the AG. So not that it doesn't happen with the IRS, the SEC, every regulatory agency, but the federal government at the time had a 2-year bar that once you left a regulatory agency, you could not appear before the agency for 2 years. And I think if it's on a related matter, that might even be longer. Now New York State has that, but they didn't at the time. So when I came to the AG's office, probably about 15 attorneys were hired at the same time to be reviewing attorneys because we had piles of papers that would be just like all over. They had no record keeping procedure. There was no public information. People would submit an offering plan and usually the attorneys would bring it down personally so they could meet you. And one of the things that Bob did is he prevented personal appearances by attorneys and nobody was allowed to take any gifts and things like that, which at the time, again, was not regulated previously.
So how are you getting these? Somebody has an offering plan, right? I guess back in that day, I understand they weren't as large given, word processing wasn't as prevalent. But would you just get something in the mail and then it would go to the general office and then they would divvy out the offering plans to review and then you would mark it up or prepare comments like a letter? How would that process work at that time?
Well, not really that different from now. And I'm talking about pre-lockdown because pre-COVID, everything had to be done in hard copy. So you've seen the offering plan books, which have gotten larger and larger over time, but because of more disclosures of various things. But we had to submit, a binder with backup documents later. And that's even when I started here in 2015. And then a few years later, the AG allowed us to submit in a form of a CD. And so the amount of paper was reduced. But back then, everything was paper. But everything was paper for years.
Yeah.
It's just that there was no tracking system, really. So at the same time, I was spending half the week on that Amtrak to Albany, lobbying specifically for legislation to change the co-op and condo conversion legislation. The result of that was in June of 1980, and I have the pen to prove it. The Quad E was passed. It was intensely negotiated by me and some state legislators and the Rent Stabilization Association, which represented the landlord group. It was the result of such heavy negotiation and intense negotiation, and the result was it standardized, at least in New York City, the system for converting buildings from rental to co-op or condo, regardless of whether the tenant was rent controlled, which rent stabilized, or free market, all of which were different. The different categories were split into different rules prior to this law being enacted. And what happened was then there was a huge boom in the number of co-op conversions. And what's good about them from the tenant point of view is it's a way to unlock equity for people who may not have, but it's also an opportunity for home ownership because not everybody was buying and flipping. People were buying and living there. A lot of New York City, particularly Manhattan, but also other neighborhoods, went from being primarily rental to primarily homeownership. On the landlord side, on the owner side, we were talking about a situation then in the early 80s when interest rates were increasing, but because of rent stabilization and rent control, limiting the amount of rent increases, landlords were losing money on basic operating costs. So converting a building was a good way of being able to maximize profit without selling the whole building itself. Because the landlord owner, I'm talking about landlord, but they're the owner of the building, still had the unsold apartments. And even though at that time the rents were still regulated by rent stabilization before vacancy decontrol and other things that changed the law in terms of rentals, tenants who didn't buy were allowed to stay forever and could only have their rents increased in accordance with those guidelines at the time. But when they left, that new unit, the newly vacated apartment, was no longer subject to stabilization. So here an owner could convert a building, and even if you said, I'm not purchasing, I don't have the money, I don't want to, whatever the reason is, 5 years later, you decide to leave for some reason, the owner can then sell that apartment on the open market. So it worked for both landlords and tenants and was the law in New York City until 2019. When the legislature, in its wisdom, decided to change the law to what it is now, 352 Quad E, which requires 51% of tenants to purchase before a building can be converted. And that's virtually impossible and pretty much killed conversions. During that time, I also worked on the Triple E, which is a conversion law slightly different in certain communities in Nassau, Westchester, and Rockland, and Single E, which applies to places that have elected throughout the state to have a conversion law. So it's primarily cities, Buffalo, Albany, Binghamton. And after the law was passed, I was still at the AG's office. I was the primary drafter, not the only drafter, but the primary drafter of the regulations of the Real Estate Finance Bureau, which had operated without regulations forever. So the policies and what an offering plan has to look like, what you have to say, what the sections are composed of. I mean, just basics on how an offering plan is drafted and what it has to disclose, because we're talking about a disclosure statute in New York. The Bureau had not had regulation.
So you wrote it?
Yes. Just this morning, I got a phone call from an attorney from a big law firm who I don't know, who said, my firm has it was a co-op problem. And we don't have anyone in our firm that handles this. And your name is around. So I was calling to see if you were interested. And if you know the background of why the AG's regulation says this. Right. I drafted the ones for conversion of occupied buildings to co-ops, conversion of occupied buildings to condos, and the new construction condominiums. There's also a new construction co-op. I think that may have happened after I left. And so, but unfortunately, those regulations have rarely been updated. And so over the course of time, I mean, these regulations were promulgated in, the mid 80s. And, just the sophistication and real world life experience of how buildings are either converted or built from scratch. There are so many different things now in today's real estate world, like I'm sure any other area of practice. So they have not been updated.
Yeah.
And
it's a shame.
It is a shame. Yeah. And they've only been updated to provide now for, electronic submission. And I was on the New York City and New York State Co-op and Condo Bar Association committees for years. And there were always liaison committees with the AG's office. There were proposed amendments that were submitted to them. Okay, so what ended up happening is I had sort of gotten a reputation for being like politically active because of all the legislation that I had worked on and things like that. And then that whole area kind of died down. And that's what was very interesting to me. And then the AG's office, I wanted to be the bureau chief because I was never the bureau chief there. And then I was told that I couldn't be the bureau chief because I was too political and not even-handed enough. But they wanted me to train the new bureau chief. And not only that, actually, I was the subject of one of the bills that we had passed when I was at NYPIRG, which was that there was now conflict of interest legislation that was passed in New York State for people who worked in regulatory agencies.
Talk about ironic.
So what happened was the legislature passed a law, and the following January, the law was going to take effect. And at that point, if you were a state employee in a regulatory capacity, I would not have been able to submit offering plans to the AG's office for 2 years. And I thought to myself, I finally have a skill that is marketable, because I didn't want to be a lobbyist my whole life. I mean, there are lobbying firms now throughout the city that do city work and state work and all that. And I was so tired of schlepping back and forth to Albany.
Right.
I just felt like I had no...
It's a trek.
Well, it was wearing, because when you get there, you're just on every moment of the day. And it was just not good for my life to do the Albany thing. So I thought, I'm going to have to leave, or else I'm going to be here forever and working on offering plans, which at that point wasn't interesting to me. And of course, there was the money too. So I kind of put myself on the market and was interviewed and solicited by a lot of firms. And as someone said at the time, I was the draft pick. But some of the law firms that I interviewed with, which some of them are not around anymore, that did a lot of co-op and condo work, were just going to make me an associate, and I would work on offering plans and things like that with no chance of really advancing, or anything like that. And the reason I went to Goldstick Weinberger at the time was that David Goldstick, who is alive today at the age of 91, not working as a lawyer. And David started the Riverside Park Conservancy, which is plants, flowers, and things. And we did pretty much all of Riverside Park. At that time, that law firm probably handled about 40% of all the offering plans submitted to the AG's office. Was like the co-op and condo law firm in the city.
You must have been familiar with them, because you've seen their
name. Oh, yeah. So David Goldstick called me up one day and he said, don't go anywhere else. You have to come here. I hear you're out there interviewing. And so I met with him and he offered me a really great deal. I liked the fact that there were other female attorneys there. The firm is small. We probably had about 20 attorneys, almost exclusively doing offering plans. David himself was an investor with a lot of our clients. And as a sponsor, he gave us the perspective of what the sponsor's looking at. When I was at the AG's office, the primary focus was, is there enough disclosure for the prospective purchasers? And the prospective purchasers usually were the tenants, but at the time during a conversion, are you telling everybody everything they need to know to become a homeowner to purchase? What was interesting is that David gave us, and there were 3 of us that were hired at the same time, their perspective of an owner of a building that's primarily rent stabilized, what they're looking at when they're converting the building. How do they figure out what kind of price point we need to offer? What discount are we going to give the tenants? Because the tenants had discounts. Are we going to allow them to assign to somebody else? So can they buy for a family member? David had all of these sort of schemes. And I don't say schemes in a negative way. I say schemes in a very interesting way. Like we did offering plans where there was a sliding scale. The more people that purchased, the lower the price would be. The more one bedrooms, the more two bedrooms. We would allow people in some cases to take a different apartment and buy that one instead of their own. So how do you price those apartments? How do you determine based on what people are paying in rent? And you can project out, because at that time, the rent stabilization, you could project out pretty much what the rent would be. And then this one would be good for combination. You would offer somebody, if they wanted to buy the one next door, they could buy that at half price. Like people who had one bedroom, bought another one next door, that kind of thing.
Yeah.
We also did a building, I'll never forget it, 41 West 82nd Street, which was on a reverse sliding scale, which was the more people that purchased, the price would be higher.
Yeah.
Because of tax considerations, the sponsor needed to only sell the minimum that would be required and not a lot of apartments. So what was great about David as a mentor, because I had never really had a mentor before, was that he kind of introduced me to what goes behind the offering plan. You know, I would see the offering plan, but it would be baked in the sense of this is what the prices are, this is what the offer is.
But how did you get there? You didn't have that perspective for that.
And particularly financially. And also the deal he offered me a very good financial situation within the firm. I mean, I came in immediately as a partner. Everybody shared. It was called equal opportunity. I don't know if law firms do that anymore. So I was, in the second year that I was there, I was the highest earner of everybody, of all the shareholders, because we divided up profits in a certain way. And it was a very congenial, friendly environment. And so I stayed there. I was there from 1987 to 1994. And it was a great environment. In 89, when there was the first real estate crash that I lived through, the FDIC was taking over savings and loans, who had given a lot of subprime. They weren't considered subprime, but they were at the time.
Yeah, hindsight is 2020.
Hindsight is 2020. They were subprime mortgages on co-op buildings. And because a co-op can have a mortgage on the entire building, and the FDIC and the federally, what was just set up at that time, the Resolution Trust Corporation, were set up to handle all of these defaulted banks which had faulty appraisals, all kinds of things like that. And what those agencies needed were experienced law firms in their various jurisdictions who knew what these assets were all about. And the legislation that set up the Resolution Trust Corp encouraged the agencies to hire women and minority-owned businesses, both as brokers, attorneys, and everything else. So at that time, my firm had 6 shareholders, 3 men and 3 women. So one of the guys dropped out of the shareholder position. So we then had majority female ownership. And I and another partner went to Washington. We went to lobby in favor of advocate our expertise in the field.
Going back to your old days.
Right. And so the way we stayed afloat during that time period, which was from about 89 to about 92, was we represented the FDIC and the Resolution Trust Corp in their auctioning co-op and condo apartments, in advising them on the offering plans and on the mortgages and on co-op and condo governance and why this was written the way it was. We analyzed loans. We would go out to these warehouses in New Jersey where all of the bank records were and spend hours going through bank files of appraisals of buildings and offering plans and all of that. And that kept our firm in business.
Yeah, but it was an almost totally different practice that you had created in order to survive. But obviously you were in a very good position to that kind of advising.
But it was very entrepreneurial. I mean, the firm was very entrepreneurial.
That pivot is important.
Yeah.
Right. And we were, as I said, David and I keep just sort of said, this is what we have to do. And we have to respond to the market. And we did. And that was a fantastic experience for me. I worked really hard. I was in a very congenial group of people. We did what we had to do, put it that way. And unfortunately, we did have to lay off a number of our support staff. We were able to sublet part of our office space. because we got smaller and the landlord agreed. And in fact, one of the interesting things is that Bernie Mendick, who was the owner of our office building, was a friend of David Goldstick. They had invested in a lot of deals together, and he was our landlord, our office landlord. All 6 partners were personally guaranteeing the office lease, which was a little scary to me because I also had a co-op apartment and I did not have a husband or other family member to help me. I was very worried. What happened was we wanted to talk to Bernie about some forbearance on our lease payments and allow us to sublet, which wasn't allowed in the lease. So we 3 female partners, only us, went to sit down with him personally and someone from his staff. And we said, we're all personally guaranteeing the lease, and I was single at the time. The other one had 2 little babies. The other one was whatever, and said, we're good for this. And David, us, and you don't know us, but you know us now. I remember we sat down, we had lunch, and we said, we want you to take us off the personal guarantee and let us sublet half our office space. And we want forbearance on our rent for at least a year, that we didn't have to pay any rent, but not have it accrue with interest. And he agreed to all.
Fantastic.
He was just a mensch about it, and it worked.
You had this turbulent period, which was, I guess, is the first crisis that you'd been, wrapped up in your career.
Yes.
And then you sort of overcame it. But why? What transitioned you to your next employment?
So what transitioned me is that I got married. So what happened is my husband was for 25 years a diplomat in the State Department Foreign Service officer, and he had lived in a lot of different places around the country. And we met while he was in Moscow during the fall of the Soviet Union.
What were you doing in Moscow?
Right. I was not in Moscow. It wasn't exactly a tourist destination at the time.
It's not really a tourist destination now either.
No, right. And we were dating, and his next assignment was to be the political counselor at the U.S. Embassy in Tel Aviv. And so that sounded really interesting to me. And I thought, you know what? I'll make this major change in my life. I have no idea what's going to happen in the future. And so we decided to get married, and he went to Israel, and then he came back. We got married. And in the fall of 1994, I went to Israel for 3 years. And I had to give up my partnership. I owned a condo at the time. I sold my condo. I sold my country house. I put all of my stuff in storage. I traded in all my wedding presents for money. So most of them, actually.
And that's the power of love, folks.
That's right. Thought, you know what? Maybe I won't be a lawyer again. I'm just willing to make this change in my life. And the idea of living in different countries, which Howard, my husband, had already done in a few other places, just sounded like a different life for me.
Yeah.
And I thought, that's interesting. So we lived in Israel for 3 years. And during that time, we adopted my daughter from China. And because of various medical issues and things like that, and because I was worried that I would not be able to have a career anymore, I wanted us to move back to New York. Yeah. He had not lived in New York. So we did, and he got a job at the U.S. mission to the United Nations, which is considered an embassy. And then after that, he worked in the United Nations system. So we moved to New York, but it had been 3 years since I'd been in my career. And
now you can file offering plans.
That's right. So
I see what you did.
Right. So I worked part-time at a small law firm because I wanted to just get my feet wet.
Yeah, dip your toe in a little.
A former client had referred me to. And when I felt like my daughter was old enough, I felt like it was appropriate for me to start working full time. And then I went to Star Associates. The person who actually told me about the position at Star was Hillary Potashnik. So Hillary was the one who told me that Star Associates, which was just being formed by attorneys who had come from other firms, was looking for someone. And I thought that it was nice that a few years ago, I was the one that brought Hillary to Seiden Schein. And so we knew each other since my AG days. So when I was at Star, we did a lot of offering plans, obviously. One of the interesting things is that Star Associates represented a lot of timeshare developers, Disney, Hyatt Vacation Club, that kind of organization. Yeah. And in order to sell those are real estate securities under New York law. And in order to sell those to New York residents, there has to be a New York filing with the AG's office. And the filing is a New York style purchase agreement. The New York, a deposit that you make when you buy it, even if you're in Florida or somewhere else, under New York law has to be held in escrow by a New York attorney. And so there's a sort of a New York supplement that has to be filed. So if you go to Disney Animal Kingdom, for example, and you say, I'm interested in buying a timeshare here, they ask you what state you live.
Oh, so they have a prospectus for offering plan for each.
Well, they have the Florida plan, which is more extensive than most states, and then they'll give you the New York supplement. And in most states, there is no prospectus requirement.
The places where you would want to buy a timeshare: Florida, Hawaii, maybe California.
You'd be surprised.
Like,
what about Branson, Missouri? Branson, Missouri, which is like the gambling capital of South, and there are a lot of timeshares there. And there are a lot of them in Las Vegas. You'd be surprised. Upstate New York, the ski areas.
Are the timeshares, are they different than doing a offering plan for a co-op?
Yes.
Other than, how are they much different other than the,
Don't give away our trade secrets.
I don't think timeshares are as big as they used to.
No, they're not. They're not. People are trying to get out of timeshares now.
Right.
But, and there's some in New York too. There's at the Park Central Hotel, which is on 57th Avenue, like sort of diagonally from Carnegie Hall. There's a section that's called the Manhattan Club. And that is a timeshare. I mean, they call it vacation, interval ownership, ownership, things like that. There's also Hilton has one that's on 57th Street. So, and the Phillips Club, which is right near Lincoln Center. They're also timeshares or interval ownership or whatever you want to say. So that introduced me to something interesting. And I did an offering plan for a condo hotel, this Thai at 400 Fifth Avenue, which was partially a sort of regular hotel, partially condos with hotel services. And you'd enter into there are many of these now around the city. St. Regis has it as well. And there's an offering plan that has to be filed for the condo hotel, because you are not only as a consumer buying the condo, but you are buying the management program where, similar to a timeshare, the company that's managing the hotel is also managing your unit. So unlike a timeshare where you maybe, let's say, have a week or you have points, you actually own this condo unit. But you're mandatorily required to enter into the management program, which means you can't decorate, you have to rent it through them, that kind of thing. So that introduced me to a group of attorneys around the country who specialize in these condo hotels, where there are a lot of them in most places like, Vegas, Atlantic City, places like that. And so that was one interesting little aspect of things. So what happened was, when we parted ways, I spoke to Alvin, who I knew for many years, and wanted to stay in the field and what I know, but I wanted to do more than just straight offering plans.
I understand why, by the way, because that could just isolate you and put you in front of these long documents.
I like long documents. I do.
We should get you involved in a few things.
Time aside and billing aside and things like that. I love jumping into a 200-page document. I think from my years of copy editing and things like that. And while there were times when I was at NYPIRG, because I made so little money, that I had a job on the side as doing freelance proofreading. And all through high school and in college. I mean, this is funny because there were 1 or 2 summers between college that I came home to Long Island, and I worked one summer, the summer after my freshman year of college. I worked at a small publishing company in the 1920s, and they did True Confessions magazine and those kinds of things. And I was a proofreader and copy editor.
Very cool. So this, your whole career is coming full circle here.
Right. Yeah. So I mean, it's just really, that's so.
And now Seiden is your home.
Seiden Schein is my home. Right. So not that I wanted to actually do the work, but I was interested in the tax incentives. Remember, I mentioned that at Goldstick, I learned from him what goes on before the offering plan is submitted. That didn't really happen when I was at Star. We had some very interesting and very high-powered clients and interesting deals to work on, but it was very bifurcated. I didn't know what went on before. I didn't know what went on after. Yeah. And I knew that there was 421A. I knew that there was ICAP, but I didn't really know how it worked. And I didn't know how a developer decided, how do you divide up the space or what are the regulations? How do you know how much goes into ICAP? So if you're designing a building, just like you figure out what amenities are going to be popular because the selling agent tells you now, you need to have like a steam room, and now you need how do you know if you're going to have retail space? You talk to a broker, you find out what it's going to be. Like there's a certain amount of this space or that space.
And that's what's cool about, like I said, tax incentives and also inclusionary housing, where if you're doing an offering plan, generally it comes at a later date once those designs have been fleshed out, and we get to see it a little bit earlier. It would be cooler to see it even earlier than that, but we get to see it a little bit earlier, and even sometimes, as Brendan knows, look at the units, pick, or suggest or advise which units to pick for, different levels, different tiers. And also you as
I'm so good at that.
Well, it's, there's so many times that I would so. And in offering plans, that's important information for you to know and understand, because those are some of the risks, right? If you don't get the tax incentive, if you don't get the zoning bonus under inclusionary housing, then you have to, it's not likely to happen, particularly if you retain our firm to do it. But it's something that's a risk, and you have to include it in the offering plan.
Well, I'll tell you, the risk is even lowered when you go to somewhere that has all the departments that you need: inclusionary, condo, tax incentive. When you have a firm that does all of those things, you've got these lawyers that are working together to make sure that your one project has all the information that it needs. And then it's a successful project.
It's a full house service.
That's right.
Right.
And back to Jane.
Right. And I'll give you an example of that, Brenda, which is 505 West 43rd Street. That one came to us as a condo subject to an inclusionary housing regulatory agreement with HPD that required that there be a certain amount of affordable apartments in this otherwise market rate condo building. There were a lot of interesting issues that came up with that. One being that it was built over Amtrak tracks. And even though the client had their own in-house attorney negotiating with Amtrak, there were parts that I got involved in because there are requirements that Amtrak has for the building owner, which was eventually the condo board, putting in a certain amount of money for inspections of exits, in case there was a fire on the tracks, how people are going to get out, for certain kinds of smoke detectors and fire alarms, exhaust and things like that. And so I was helping the client's in-house attorney deal with Amtrak on the issues that related to the condo, because I knew that we would have to figure into the common charges these costs of these Amtrak obligations, and we had to adequately disclose the worst possible case, because what you're always concerned about in an offering plan is the issue of disclosure. And a lot of times clients who are not sophisticated will say, oh, you don't have to say this. So we come across as the bad guys saying, you do have to say this. You don't want them to be a $100,000 bill that Amtrak all of a sudden sends to the condo board and the unit owners sue the sponsor because they didn't disclose this as a possibility. So in that building, because of the community board had agreed to an Article 11 tax exemption, which would have made the affordable housing affordable, but it had to be in its own separate tax lot. So instead of having the condo itself have affordable housing units, we had to create a co-op within the condo. And this took a lot of explaining to both HPD and also to the office, which made us submit a separate co-op offering plan for the inclusionary housing units within the condominium. Yeah. I don't think anything like that had ever been done before.
I had worked on that project. It was very interesting. It was home ownership. We did the inclusionary housing. Was there 421A on the market rate condos? I don't remember 421A. If it was the old one or not, but
no, there was no 421A, and that was one of the reasons why
they needed that have Article 11.
Have the Article 11. So it was something very unusual, but it's just an example of how, even though I've been in this practice for a million years, there's always something new that comes up. I mean, and I'll give another example. Greenpoint condominium, 21 Indias, because land is so scarce in New York. The rezoning, the city has engaged in large-scale rezoning of sites that used to be factories, sites that used to be hospitals, sites that used to be unused, whatever, and rezoned for residential use. And 21 India, it's on the water in Greenpoint, and it used to be a plastics factory. So you can imagine the amount of environmental remediation that had to happen there. Now, we don't get involved in that. Clients have environmental firms that have to dig up the dirt and do whatever they have to do, deal with the state and city environmental protection agencies, and often have an environmental attorney expert involved. But we need to know what happened, because we have to disclose in the offering plan. We don't have to say this used to be a garbage dump, but we do have to say there was environmental cleanup and it was done by so-and-so, signed off by the state. If you want more information, this is the report number. And there are people who are very concerned about living in a place that used to have environmental problems, maybe because they have some underlying health condition or whatever. So you have to say it. You have to mention it. So I've learned a lot about environmental remediation,
Well, I mean, you have to know the dangers in order to be able to write about the risks.
But I'm just saying is that there are things that you wouldn't think as a condo attorney you'd have to know about. Am I an expert in environmental law? No, absolutely not. But in that building, too, the city had rezoned and required building owners to contribute a certain amount to the park department to create a walkway along, which is going to probably run a long distance
along the waterfront.
Along the waterfront.
And that's I think every building on that waterfront.
Right.
And we did also the inclusionary 421A for that building as well.
Yes, we did. And so we had to set up a homeowners association to collect money to be able to pay the city. So, what makes it interesting for me is that there's always something interesting and different.
What are you seeing? You're saying new and interesting things. If you have anything that you have in mind, which are the trends as to what's going on in the condo co-op world, or if you have an idea of what you think is to come, love to hear it.
Right now, with interest rates being what they are and construction lenders being reluctant to lend on new construction condo projects, and there is probably an oversupply of very expensive high-end apartments, partly because many of them were built expecting foreign investment, which hasn't happened for various political reasons that I won't discuss. But the need for housing that's not necessarily for the lowest income people and not for the highest income people is really important. And that's why you see buildings being built on former industrial sites, former gas stations, things like that, because the developers will go through whatever they have to do to build on land which is very scarce.
Yeah.
And my advice to anybody in the field is to network as much as possible with the people who are involved when the developers are at the early stages of trying to decide what to buy and not. And one of the things that I feel like I bring to the table is I get phone calls from lenders who say, we're in the process of lending on this potential condo project. Look at what the developer sent us. What do you see as the downsides? What do you see as the downsides for us as a lender? Yeah. And I get a lot of those kinds of assignments.
Well, it makes sense. You're working on the developer side. The lender wants to hear your advice on the developer side.
Or if the developer the bank has foreclosed and there's sort of what we call like a white knight that's coming in to take over, the bank will want to know, what are the pros and cons here?
Not dissimilar to what you were doing with the feds in the crash in '89.
That's right. So that's something that requires looking at maybe somebody else's offering plan, but maybe someone else's just plans.
Another pivot. History repeats itself, Jane. Yeah. Another pivot. And, luckily, I think times are going to get better. We're going to get back 421A. The city's going to get back on track. And, New York always survives, I think. And Jane, it was wonderful. You are one of the jewels and cornerstones of Seiden Schein, in our opinion, and I think in everybody else's. And if people do look to you for your advice, you have a lot of institutional knowledge. You have a lot of experience. And you've been through a lot, and we value your opinion and so happy that you were able to join us here today and make the time to do it and be so helpful and so giving with your time.
If you guys want to contact Jane, just go to our website, seidenschein.com.
Please contact her with any questions you have about.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks. Well, everyone, that's our show. Thanks so much for listening.
And of course, don't forget to subscribe. Also, don't forget to leave comments, because we love to hear from our audience, right, Brenda?
Yeah, feel free to reach out at info@seidenschein.com or visit our website at seidenschein.com. We really look forward to hearing from you.
You could also reach out to David and Brenda at dshamchovich@seidenschein.com and Bieslakowski@seidenschein.com.
Those are lengthy last names. You can just find us on our website.
That's right.